Welcome to the fifth installment of the MUD Parcel Reading Series for 2022. The series is a video companion to the MUD Proposal Online Journal and Archive. It's currently on its seventh annual edition. It's updated annually and features poets and projects that are international in scope and often multidisciplinary in focus. I'm Pat Clifford. I'm a poet, social worker, and producer of the series. And my co-editor, Aryanil Mukherjee, is here as our host and discussant. Today we'll meet, we'll have four poets together this time around from four different places, times, and languages to commemorate the Buddhadeva Bose and George Oppen translation and connection story. So, Aryanil, do you want to kick it off with kind of set the tone?
Sure. Thank you, Pat, and welcome everyone. Welcome José, Kozer, and Peter Boyle. Approximately 6 decades ago, in 1961, two poets accidentally met in New York City. Although coevals, they were vastly separated by geography, culture, society, language, and literary traditions. Bengali Indian poet Buddhadeva Bose in Bengali accent and Buddhadeva Bose in English was on his second sabbatical in the United States at New York University. When New Directions Press began to toy with the idea of publishing an anthology of his Bangla poems translated into English. In that connection, Bose met American poet George Oppen, who had returned to his country of origin after a prolonged stint in Mexico. 1961 to 1964 marked George Oppen's return to poetry publishing. New Directions sought his help in assisting Bose, who had actually translated his poems into English, but it needed some Americanizing of his Indo-British tongue. That was one beginning, which had, in an unpredictable way, led to other beginnings of collaboration and camaraderie across continents and languages over the next few decades. Today, we will see some of it.
Yeah, and Aryanil and my connection to this material and our relationship to it began about 15 years ago. At that time, I was immersed in Oppen's new collected poems as part of the celebration of his centenary in 2008. And I had recently met Aryanil, and we were becoming friends and getting to know each other. And in the materials section of the book, I had noticed that there were two poems by Buddhadeva Bose, whose name sounded Indian to me, but there wasn't much background to the content in the footnotes. And so we actually met at for drinks at one of the oldest bars in Cincinnati that has actually been continuously operating since 1860. And so we were in this old bar, and I brought the new collected with me. And when I showed it to Aryanil, he seemed quite shocked at this inclusion of this translation attempt by this Bengali poet from the early 60s. And so this realization really caused like a deepening discussion on our part, and then a research project over the last couple of years, both in the States and in Kolkata, that then resulted in an article that I published, but it was a collaborative effort with Aryanil, and it appeared in Jacket 2, and we're going to include the link to that full story on the series website. And so that in turn resulted in Peter Boyle, our guest, reaching out to Aryanil in around 2011 when he was translating José Kozer's work, which featured one of these poems in his work, his poem Anima for George Oppen. So you can see that the interesting entangled webs that are coming together with this whole effort. So we're joined today, just in terms of brief bio, by both José Kozer and Peter Boyle. José is a prolific poet and author. He's coming to us now from Florida. He was born in Havana, Cuba in 1940 to Jewish parents who emigrated from Poland and Czechoslovakia. Left Cuba in 1960, lived in New York until 1997, when he retired from Queens College, where he taught Spanish and Latin American literature for 32 years. His recent work includes Anima, which we'll be discussing today, from the Fondo de Cultura, 2002, the Y del Esparto de Invariabilidad from Visor, 2005, and Trasfondsando from Monte Avila Press in 2007. And then there's a couple bilingual English-Spanish works. One was Stet, Junction Press in 2006, translated by Mark Weiss. And then the Anima came out in English, a bilingual translation from Shearsman in 2011, translated by Peter. And then Indole from Manzanas in 2012, also translated by Peter. And then finally, José was the 2013 recipient of the Premio de Poesía Iberoamericana Pablo Neruda in Chile. And then some may remember Peter Boyle, who's also joining us from a segment we did earlier this year. He's coming to us from Sydney, Australia. Recent works include What the Painter Saw in Our Faces, 2001, Apocrypha of William O'Shaughnessy, 2009, Towns in the Great Desert, New and Selected Poems, 2013, and Ghost Speaking, 2016. Actually, 2013 was the New and Selected. So Boyle has translated French and Spanish poets, including Federico Garcia Lorca, Cesar Vallejo, and of course, José Kozer. So welcome, José and Peter. We appreciate you joining us. So we might kick it off. I don't know if you want to say a few words, but we thought we might kick off the discussion with an actual reading of the poem Anima for George Oppen in both Spanish and English. And then if each of you want to say a few words to get the conversation rolling, that would be great.
A little correction to both of you. The pronunciation is Kozer and not Kozer.
Kozer.
And it's not your fault. There's
okay.
no accent in there, so this mistake is made frequently. I think
Okay.
the only one by now who does it right is Peter.
It's pure accident.
Anyhow.
So while you read, I'm going to go off camera.
I'm sorry?
Said while you read, I'm going to go off camera.
Okay. First, I must say this. I am grateful to Peter that he thought translating this poem and another 3 poems as part of the book in the bilingual publication was to his liking. I am, forgive me for saying this, so prolific. I'm getting close to 15,000 poems that I don't pay attention to what poems are of interest, or I produce them. I don't know how. They are written very fast. They are corrected next day slowly. They go into the computer, and what we call in Latin tabula rasa, that is to say, it all disappears from me. But Peter made a point of Anima for George Oppen, and that opened a lot of thoughts because it's a poem that I remember curiously very well, but I had simply forgotten it. So this type of collaboration, which with Peter has lasted now, I think close to 20 years, is something I believe in. I'm working now with painters. I just did a book with a Cuban painter that I care for very much. It's coming out in Mexico. I'm sorry, in Toronto by a Mexican editor. I just did one with a designer in Brazil. The book came yesterday. It's a jewel of a book, very beautiful. And I'm doing one with a Cuban painter in whom I'm very interested, and vice versa, who lives in Parma, Italy. So these are the projects, as this one with you people, that make me very happy and very interested in. So that this collaboration has been, to me personally, wonderful, because I write a poem a day, which opens up many levels of negative criticism and misunderstandings, as if I was very prolific. I consider that not very prolific. A poem a day is really nothing. It could be maybe 5, 6 poems a day. Then, you know, we're talking business. So Anima was written while I had a scholarship in Germany, 45 minutes away from Munich. And this is real, I was one day going to Munich with my wife from this place called Feldafing. And I was there 2 months, so that's 60 days, and I ended up writing 60 poems. And that ended the book. It was one a day, and I was satisfied with the book. And it's a book that somehow has been liked very much. It was translated into Russian through Peter's translation into English. And it's been, I hate to use the word, but it's been a successful book. And then to the Shearsman Books publication, Peter added these 4 poems. And I rediscovered the one I'm going to read now, which is called Anima for George Oppen. Oppen's name was really Oppenheimer, which means open home. And that's another belief that I think is very important. The home should be open to everyone, and then you decide whether you want to repeat or not. And that's a wonderful part of my life, where I have always shared, while I was in New York especially, my house, my family, with many Latin American poets and Spanish poets that enriched my life, and I hope I left some enrichment in their lives also. Agreste, y pese a la desproporción de lo agreste, rostro, diente de perro, paso la mañana en tránsito leyendo a George Oppen. Una fruta del tamaño de Buda, no me atrevo a abrir la boca, no hay cupo, puede que de cera, puede que de plomo, fruta de un bodhisattva, el poema de George Oppen basado en un poema de Buddhadeva Bose, diente de perro, asimismo el rostro de Oppen, una fruta de piel lisa, fruncir la flor, el ovario para transformarse en fruto. Tengo la certeza de haber visto tras el resplandor las manzanas rojo, amarillo, rojo a su sombra de Cézanne. There is this guy in the train to Munich reading my book of poems. No se oye otra voz, momento inmemorial, se puede oír el ala de una mosca rozar la roca más dura, posarse entre la ceniza negra del Fukuyama, su zumbido incrustarse en la intimidad del metal ferroviario, carbonizarse. Se avanza, no obstante. Página 94. El tren ensañado en la velocidad para alcanzar su destino, oh Bodhisattva. Invocación. George Oppen, luz concomitante, llévate a la boca una manzana de Cézanne, el cuadro permanecerá intacto, ya es de inmemorialidad. Los conos de luz, hambre unísona, omnívora, mastica dodecaedro, escupe en cualquier dirección 3 semillas. 3 semillas, George Oppen, que tu reverso estás muerto y que, apéate. Kant acaba de besar en la boca al famo. En los cielos, Efraín y Esther, 2 branquias a la resurrección. Todo se ensambla, cierro el libro, próxima estación, Marienplatz, Solavaya, Dachau. Y tras los rieles a su encuentro, donde las vacas pastan, gran novedad.
Okay. Shall I read the English?
Sure, Peter. If you can read the English, your English translation, that would be great.
Anima for George Oppen. Rugged landscape, and despite the excess of rugged landscape, face like jagged rock, I spend the morning in transit reading George Oppen. A piece of fruit the size of Buddha, I don't dare open my mouth. Nothing is bite-size. It might be wax or lead, fruit of a bodhisattva, The poem of George Oppen, based on a poem of Buddhadeva Bose, jagged as Oppen's face, a smooth-skinned fruit, the flower's ovary wrinkles to transform into fruit. I know for certain that in the shining brilliance I've seen the apples of Cézanne, red, yellow, red, in their darkness. There is this guy in the train to Munich reading my book of poems. No other voice can be heard. A moment beyond memory. You can hear a fly's wing brush the hardest rock, settle among the black ash of Fujiyama. Its buzzing embed itself into the intimacy of metal, railway track. We go forward nonetheless. Page 94. The train furiously intent on the speed needed to reach its destination, O Bodhisattva. Invocation, George Oppen, concomitant light. Lift one of Cézanne's apples to your mouth. The painting stays intact. Already it is beyond memory. Two cones of light, hunger in unison, one omni-mode. Chew the dodecahedron. From your other side, you are dead. In any direction you like, spit free seeds. 3 seeds, George Oppen. And what then? A light. Kant has just kissed his servant on the mouth. And in the heavens, Ephraim and Esther are the gills of 2 fish opening on resurrection. Everything is joined together. I close the book. Next stop, Marienplatz. My fingers crossed against you, Dachau. And beyond the tracks as I go to meet it, where cows graze, something extraordinarily new.
That was wonderful. Thank you for your introduction and for your 2 readings. So maybe as like an introduction prompt, it's like what kind of led you to think of this poem by Oppen in the first place, José, and how does it fit into the? Maybe talk a little bit also about your Anima series and how does this fit into the Anima series?
Well, it's good that you use the word series because the only thing that makes me suffer when I write poetry is the title. So that by using series, all I have to do is take the new poem and fit it in one of my 40, 50 series without worrying about title, although there are titles also. So as I said, I had the scholarship in Germany, wonderful, the treatment, everything. There was a painter, an American painter, a woman. There was an Israeli newspaperman. I'm sorry, movie maker. Then a German writing newspaper journalist who was very good and very well known. So we were five people, 4 of them very happy together. The 5th was a pain in the ass, but it was harmonious. It happens, and we were extremely well treated. I never forget that experience. It was cut off because the mayor of Munich decided to use the money for rock and all those things and not poetry. Okay. I wrote this poem as part of a series called Anima, which, if I recall correctly, must be around 450 poems with that same title. So that I do work in series where I can fit, but it's basically a mood, a certain understanding of poetry and a certain level of search, which is basically a search through poetry of the spiritual, which has led me to, the Hindu tradition, the Zen Buddhism, which I have practiced for many years, a vision that, not that it's not political, it's almost impossible, especially nowadays, not to be political, but basically poetical, that interests me more than anything else. I'm basically a loner. I've always been a loner since I was a child. And that gives me the opportunity of doing certain things without having to justify it to the world. Because not that I'm dismissing the world, but that to a degree, I'm so busy with reading and writing, which I've been doing since I'm 16 years old, and I'm now 82, that, and you know, my family life, which is so important to me, my marriage to Guadalupe, which is wonderful. We'll be 48 years married very soon. And, you know, just meeting poets constantly, painters, writers. It's been a wonderful life. I have to put it this way, and I have no complaints. An acceptance of death, and kind of at this point, everything is coming together. A friendship like the one I have with Peter, to me, become almost sacred. We talk in this house about him. Everything that we communicate, I send to my wife, so on and so forth. So I was forced to look into this poem, and the first thing I noticed, which kind of was so interesting to me, was it begins with the word agreste. And it is related not to landscape, as Peter translates, but to the face of Oppen when he was older. You remember Auden, W.H. Auden, he had this wrinkled face, terribly wrinkled. Oppen, as time went by, his face was like what we call in Cuba, diente de perro, which is a type of rock that you have to be very careful when you're walking there, because it hits you. I mean, it goes through your shoes. It's very harsh, very strong. And I compare his face to this diente de perro. The beginning of the poem, then, it was meant to me one way, and to Peter a totally different way, landscape. And of course, I'm in a new landscape, Germany. I'm in a country that has been problematic to Jews, to say the least, and yet at the same time, a country that has accepted the assimilation of Jews to a degree that I think very few countries have. And basically not a anti-Semitic country for many years, except for, you know, the interval of Hitler and what happened there. As a point of information, on my father's side, all his brothers were murdered in Auschwitz, and his parents, mother and father, were murdered in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. So, you know, at home, mother always spoke very tragically about this. My father never said a word, never said a word. The only person he opened up, I would say barely, on that issue was with me. We would sit in the terrace in this place in Havana and just, then my poetry is very referential. There's some Ezra Pound there, a little bit of Eliot. And this continuity in this poem, since I had to look into it, I find it interesting. I don't know if, I hope you don't mind me sharing with you some thoughts. But for instance, at first I thought that Buddha Bose was a fellow who did a book on 80 asanas and 10 mudras. And he was an individual that perfected yoga. And I was under that impression from my reading, until I realized, conversing through emails with Peter, that it was this, you know, very famous poet of India, who was, in a sense, the successor of Rabindranath Tagore, who was translated into Spanish by Juan Ramón Jiménez's wife. So there's a whole story.
Sorry to interrupt, José. So that Buddhadeva Bose, who was a practitioner of the yogasanas, is a different person. You know
Yes.
that, right? Yeah.
Yes. That was at first my mistake.
Right.
That's why, you know, I saw that my own poem as kind of
You couldn't match the two.
until Peter made me realize, no, there's this poet. So I looked it up, I did my research, indeed. Yeah. The poem, for instance, brings the painter Cézanne, and it makes a point, because Cézanne decomposed geometrically an apple. And his geometrization and decomposition of things is very well known. Picasso, huge ego, admires Cézanne above everyone else. So that, to me, Cézanne is one of the sources of learning and understanding creativity. So he appears in here, and at one point, Oppen himself is eating geometry rather than food. You know, there is a point also in here where the train is moving, and it's very ambiguous because it says in English, there's this guy in the train to Munich reading my book of poems. Now, that voice, who's the narrator, meaning myself, realistic? Is it Oppen's book that is being read? So the ambiguity is what moves me and makes me interested in the issue, and the poem moves from item to item. For instance, I remember at one point someone asked me, what's Kant doing in there? And it comes from a book by Thomas de Quincey, which I read and then reread, first in English and then in Spanish, where it's called The Last Days of Immanuel Kant. It's a little book, maybe 100 pages, and it's fascinating, as De Quincey can be. And in that book, he kisses in the mouth his servant, who has been with him many, many years. And there's some homoerotic issue in there involved, because it was Kant never got married. There's a possibility that he was. But to me, that was not important. What became important is Kant is the man who philosophically insists on the impossibility of knowing God and God being explained. And he, for instance, says metaphysics is nothing but a black cat lost in a black room where nothing exists. So that's his definition of metaphysics. And I don't give too much thought to this referentiality. It happens, and the poem goes on until I realize that this poem ends in Dachau or Dachau. And of course, I had to associate that with my father and what happened to him in Auschwitz, which they're all both. Dachau is 13 kilometers away from Munich up north. Auschwitz is around there, Bergen-Belsen, all those concentration camps and what it meant. So that's the connection. Kant saying there is no way of knowing God. Well, there's no way of knowing how a God can permit a camp of extermination of not only Jews, but other people. And everything connects. Even before that, in the reading that I did a couple of times for this reunion, there are two characters that appear in the heavens, which are Ephraim and Esther, and those are my uncles in real life. And their story is a very complex and very beautiful family story that means the Jewish diaspora, the new when we had to leave. My father leaves Poland, comes to Cuba with $1 in his pocket. His father says to him, "Where is Cuba?" And he says, "I really don't know." So to that degree, he is a foreigner reaching Cuba and falling in love with that country. Then he had to leave again and went to Mexico, where he was very uncomfortable. Left Mexico 5 years after, and that's how I began to travel to Mexico through them. Came to Miami and lived very unhappily in the United States. And I remember him pacing back and forth like the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo and Eliot's famous Bruford poem. And he always said, after I left Cuba, I have no life. That was my real country. I was so happy there, And part of my own story is the happiness of living in Cuba. I had a very happy child, extremely happy. And it's never to be repeated, as time goes by. So all these references that came together had enriched my vision of this poem, thanks again to Peter and insisting on wanting to translate this poem. Peter is very cautious when it comes to doing things, and he always asks. So he said to me, I remember, do you mind if I add 4 poems to the English publication? I said, no, go ahead. After all, you always do with me whatever you want.
Well, Peter, maybe if you could say a few words about your process, because it seems like this, it was fascinating how like a lot of the themes that are coming out of your poem are the themes that Oppen was grappling with when he was trying to translate what Buddhadeva Bose was trying to share. It was kind of like, to me, it kind of reminds me of a prism, where it's like there's an original source, and then Oppen kind of created this prism out of it, and then out of that, not only formally it can expand, but also thematically it can expand as well. So maybe Peter, if
well, I've just been over the last few days, I've been rereading the Oppen and the Bose and then José's poem. And it kind of strikes me that in many ways, José is kind of closer to Bose than to Oppen, unconsciously, in the sense that there's a spirituality there. And even ending with that, or in the English, but in Spanish, Gran Navidad, and I have it as something extraordinarily new, which sounds not unlike the ending of Still Life in Bose's translation of Bose.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that José is coming at spirituality, but using a totally different technique to what Bose was doing. And part of the alienness of Bose is the sort of very wording and the archaicness of the language, particularly in memory, not so much in Still Life, which I think could have passed as a poem by Rilke and works perfectly well in English. Yeah. But I just really admire, I was really drawn to José's poem because of the way it brings together so many dimensions and flows so smoothly. There's in Australia, at least, we have an expression of someone having a face like the map of Switzerland, which also is that jagged look, which is rugged landscape. So their face is like a mountain range, which is what I thought that José was getting at. But there's a beautiful flow to José's poem, a kind of energy driving it forward at the same time as a spirituality that's lifting it to a different sort of dimension, but one that's embodied in images and in reality. Yeah. I mean, you've got so many things coming together: Japan, Cézanne, George Oppen, Bose, the train to Munich, Dachau, Kant, a whole cosmos being presented in terms of a rapid train ride. And then a voice that I always imagined as being like the ghost of George Oppen, or George Oppen speaking, because he's saying there's a guy reading, on the train to Munich, reading my book of poems, which is in English in the original. So it's a really interesting poem. And there were 4 poems which are in E della spatula in variedad. Sorry, my mouth is all tangled. But they were in that collection, but not in José's original Anima, even though they're called Anima. They were just in a different book. And I wanted to include them because they just stood out to me as, wonderful poems that I wanted to add in. And I'm very glad I did, yeah.
Aryanil, did you have some questions to add, or maybe narrating when Peter reached out to you for some more background on the poem?
I don't have questions, but I'm simply, overwhelmed with pleasure and the wondrous experience that I have had all along, starting with Bose. I grew up in Calcutta, where Bose lived, and I've had in many ways, my life kind of intersected with that of the Bose family in many different ways. I think I saw him. I have a very almost faded memory of seeing him once in a marriage party when I was in grade 4. I was about 9.5. My father was my late father was a professor of history, and he was an ambitious young literature at that time in the 1970s. And he knew Bose. They used to often meet. And that year, the year of Bose's passing, 1974, my class teacher was Bose's eldest daughter, Meenakshi. And she was my favorite high school teacher of all my high school years, grade school and high school years. Pardon?
She was also a poet, no?
She was not a poet, but she has written a couple of memoirs, one about her father. The youngest daughter, who Pat met, again through familial connections,
His wife,
was a writer and publisher. So we used to call our class teacher Auntie. We were in an English medium school where the medium of instruction was English, and the auntie was gone for a month. I kept missing her as a small boy, and then I learned that auntie's father had passed. And then, this eldest daughter, she was married to a next generation Bengali poet, very well known translator to Jyotirmoy Datta, and he and I kind of met mostly over the phone. We had never met in person, but he was following my poetry as I was getting published, and he liked my work, and we met, and we used to talk about very many interesting stuff. And then a American gentleman called Pat Clifford came into my life. And then Peter Boyle contacted me by email asking about Pat's work. Peter had found it on Jacket, and he was not sure who did the research, if it was me or Pat. And through him, I came to know about you, José, and it just went on. So it's this wonderful. It is so beautiful. It's a real beautiful connection. So I felt at some point that this should be shared with the world.
Yeah, to me, it's like, I think it's an example of translation, cross-cultural translation. Was it perfectly done? No, but I think there was a sincere attempt to really reach out and to kind of like expand, challenge your assumptions and expand your horizons, and to try to see how to make things fit, And so maybe as like our last round of comments or questions, like what does this connection teach us about translations? Like, what are some lessons learned that we can then take with us into our poetic practice or translation practice?
Being translated and well translated, which I think is the case with Peter, because he's very cautious, he checks everything, consults everything, and then, as I always say to him, you're the translator, you finalize what's going to appear in a book. But Peter has been an example of someone who deals with the easier and more transparent poetry of mine, early poetry, and the very dense poetry. For instance, there's a book of mine that is extremely dense. It's an extremely Jewish, almost theological book, which is called Carece de Causa. And Peter founded, or who knows what at this point, and he decided to translate it. And I am sure, because I have a number of translators now into different languages, but no one would pick up Carece de Causa. It's just much too difficult, and it involves knowledge of Judaism, knowledge of Jewish theology, Jewish history, the Bible, especially in this case, the Old Testament, so that he dares, and the results are good. So, chapeau, this is something one is really grateful to. I met Peter maybe 20 years ago in Caracas, Venezuela, and he was translating at the time. What's his name, Peter?
Eugenio Montejo.
Eugenio Montejo, who was a wonderful human being and a good poet, not my cup of tea, I should say. And he was always very cordial, very open, and a wonderful friend, which is, to me, very important. When Peter appeared at breakfast, we were the first one we were already hungry at 5 in the morning. So, we're there very early and we got to talk. And here is a new experience to me, a translator who lives in Australia, who had physical difficulties, and yet he took this plane that traveled like 24 hours to Caracas. And I think we hit it nicely. And I said to myself, I'm going to rob Peter from this transparent poetry and I'm going to get him into the middle of the road, which I think he never forgive.
Well, that's great. I mean, it speaks to like the work, the hard work that needs to be done, like with the research, cultural, historical work needs to be done. But you also speak about the relationships and the importance of relationships and friendships and connections that this kind of translation work speaks to. And it's like you mentioned, like things like might not be your cup of tea. And I think between Bose and Oppen, it was like neither of them were necessarily writing what there was each other's cup of tea, but they could see beyond that to some of the underlying issues that they're both made grappling with on two ends of that prism. So,
well, I think that there's a significant difference that, particularly if you look at that first poem, Memory, I can see why Oppen would have considered it sort of untranslatable, just belonging to too different a poetics, belonging to a poetic culture that's kind of incompatible with vivid imagery, with things that are clear, meanings that are clear, tactile meanings. Whereas José Kozer's poetry and my own views on poetry really align fairly well. I mean, they're tough to translate, but it's not like I feel like I'm dealing with someone whose poetry I don't like, or it's tough to translate for a totally different reason. And I feel that I'm never going to be doing it justice because I'm going to be trying to twist it into something that it isn't.
Right.
So I think there's those things, but you can have a considerable flexibility as a translator that you might, find some poems by Aryanil Mukherjee that I do like, that I do admire. I translate those. Others I'm not so confident about. And then I can work with someone as completely different as José Kozer. And I've also translated people like Marosa de Giorgio and Olga Orozco, who are quite different again. Yeah,
that's a very interesting observation and very interesting and important point, Peter. I would like to add to that. I was reading Still Life by Bose in original Bengali today morning, and I realized that I might have forgotten that his translation, his English translation, was actually not quite a translation. He had it was more of a transcreation. So he was already transcreating the English version, and he was purposely dropping images, words, in order to make it more relevant to a Western audience. And on top of that, Oppen comes in and suggests changes. And in some lines, I suspect that Oppen might have asked for a word-to-word translation of his original Bengali poem, because I see Oppen has inserted certain words which are exactly literal translations of the Bengali.
oh, wow.
Like, it's really interesting. It didn't occur to me the first time when we were discussing Pat and myself. For example, in Still Life, if I may read the poem, first interesting point is the title of the poem is in English, but it's written in Bengali, in Bengali script. It's called Still Life. And the poem I'll read the Bengali version. Shonali apel, tumi kemon acho? চুমো খাওয়া হাসির কৌটোয় দাঁতের আভায় জ্বলা লাল ঠোঁটে বাতাস রাঙাবে? ঠান্ডা, আঁটো, কঠিন কোণারকের বৈকুণ্ঠ জাগাবে অপ্সরী স্তনে ভরা অন্ধকার হাতের মুঠোয়? এ তো তবু তোমার আরম্ভ মাত্র, হেমন্তের যেন অন্ত নেই। গন্ধ, রস, স্নিগ্ধতা জড়িয়ে থাকে এমনকি উন্মুখ নিচলে। তৃপ্তির পরেও দেখি আরো বাকি, এবং ফুরালে থামে না পুলক, পুষ্টি, উপকার। কিন্তু শুধু এই, তাই ভেবে সবাই ঘুমিয়ে পড়ে। কিন্তু মাঝে মাঝে আসে ভারী চোখের দু একজন কামাতুর, যারা থালা, ডালা, কাননের ছদ্মবেশ সব ভাঁজে ভাঁজে ছিঁড়ে ফেলে। নিজেরা তোমার মধ্যে অদ্ভুত আলোতে হয়ে ওঠে আকাশ, অরণ্য আর আকাশের তারা, যা দেখে হঠাৎ কেঁপে আমাদেরও ইচ্ছে করে অন্য কিছু হতে। So the last three lines, if I go to the English version that Bose had written, the very last three lines are, and in a strange spell of light becomes in you a forest, a spacious sky. We too then wish we were something else. Bose had dropped these two words, we too, in the last line. But his original Bengali used the word amadero, and amadero means we too. And so Oppen had put back the same word, which was really interesting, that how come he chose those two words, which are the exact translation of the Bengali word. So I suspect that Oppen might have asked Bose to read the poem out and do a literal translation word for word.
What's interesting is that as you do your reading in Bengali, suppose you don't know a word of Spanish, and for the first time you read a text in Spanish, you can recognize words. In your reading, I cannot recognize anything. So it becomes pure poetry. It becomes a totally different experience because you said it. I know we're dealing with not only with a poem, but with a highly recognized poet, and also totally unknown to the world to a degree. And yet, it's a poem that I can only deal with it through my ears, not through my eyes, because your writing is so beautiful. This fellow Tipu interviewed me in English, and then he translated everything into Bengali. He sent it to me, and when I saw it, I was enthralled. It's so beautiful physically. You can eat it.
The script. Right.
Yeah, the script. So that this dimension, it's in a state of total separateness from the poem. I'll take the liberty, because I went to haphazardly, I went to Oppen, and I found this line that says, having risen, which almost, of course, is Christ, having risen, then he says, approach the window as if to see what really was going on, and saw rain falling. So you have the expectation of something mystical, and it goes into the most trite, which is the train that has taken me to Munich with a book. I'm writing a poem, I'm reading a book, my wife is sitting next to me, and 3-4 worlds, which explains the changes in the referentiality. And then I took a Bose poem, and it's so completely different. It says, a lump of flesh is man, highly biblical, highly almost like the metaphysical poets in the English tradition. A pot of slime, a pail of primal urges. It has a density, a depth in such few words that a whole notion of life and death revealing to you in there. And that's what makes poetry not read and yet a very special thing, you know, very special.
Well, yeah, this has been a great conversation. We could really go on and on, but we're kind of reaching our time. But I think, Dave, that's a great place to end it, because it really is just that fascinating work in the you know, in the poetry. All of this complexity is both expounded and made simple. So, and this is just the perfect example of that in process. So thank you to our guests, José Kozer and Peter Boyle, and we appreciate you joining us today, and we appreciate all the people who are viewing and watching and listening to this series. And we invite you to all to come back in the next month or so for the next installment of our MUD Parcel Reading Series. Thank you very much.